That's wonderful. So what will you teach?
This lot again, which is great, I've already got that. And the introduction to literary texts.
Yeah.
So, Aston Papers and King Lear.
King Lear's coming.
Yeah, it is actually.
Oh,
It would be possible to perhaps, I don't know if you do those sorts of things, but we'll try to encourage them to read it.
It's better.
And we can also
Next, we're all going. Hi everyone, thanks for coming. We usually have a few more people wander in. I'll pass the mark sheet round, so if you could just mark yourself off. This is Greer Johnson.
Hi.
Who wrote the paper that you read on textual transformations. And she's here, we've got about 20 minutes, which is marvellous, to talk us through.
I don't know if it's marvellous.
To talk us through the idea of with, against, and across. So just to get, good to hear it from first one working about it. And we'll have time for questions afterwards, but we'll get going. So thank you.
I'm really genuinely pleased to be here. I've actually in the past taught this course for years and years, and I know you're in excellent hands with Ian, so I've been hearing about how you're going and so on. So I would like to just go over a few points for you, but I know that you've been asked to bring questions to class, and certainly even if you haven't brought a question to class and you think about something, I'd like to be able to perhaps answer it or try to answer it, respond to it. I've been asked to talk about the concepts of with, across and against the text. So it's important to remember that with these concepts, we're not only talking about reading, but we're also talking about writing. So you can read with, across and against the text, and you can also write in a similar pattern. And so it's important to be able to know what these concepts mean so that you can actually carry out the transformation that you'll be doing. You've started work on the intervention, the second assignment? Yeah. Okay. So first of all, the first key point that you must get a handle on is reader positioning. Reader positioning is what you need to know in order to start these, enact these three reading practices. So I'm going to effectively go through 4 points. First is, what is reader positioning? The second is, how does a text try to position a reader? The third is, how does the reader have any power to resist a text positioning? Not just does a reader have any power, because you do, but how does a reader have any power to resist the text positioning? And the fourth point is, well, why bother? Why are you bothering to do this at all? Okay, so we'll go back to the first point. So what is reader positioning? If we look at the concept of a text, and we're operating within the widest notion of a text here, it's not just a story, it can be a cultural practice, or it can be literary or non-literary. So what is reader positioning? You've got a text, and what does it mean to be positioned as a reader? Okay, well, you've already done quite a lot of literary theory in the beginning of the course, so a lot of these things will ring bells. First of all, you need to assume that no text is neutral. A successful text appears to be neutral, that it doesn't have a persuasive element to it. It appears that way. But when you really consider it, all texts try to position the reader in some particular way. So then we get to other terms like text trying to position you to accept or agree with the text, So it's somehow the text is constructed, and this doesn't mean to say that every author sits down and tries to do that. But let's just leave the author for the moment and just look at the text. And all texts try to position you in some particular way. So if we go with the notion of positioning, we have to look at the notion of ideology or discourses. I know that you're going to be doing this later on today, so that's cool, that's okay. Yeah. So every text has some sort of a ideological or discursive position. And successful texts make that link between the reader and the discursive position. So they come together, and that means you're reading with the text. So is that clear? So it means that you believe, or believe's not really, but you agree with the way in which the text is positioning you. Okay, and that second point, how does the text position you? So we're only talking about the one-way street at the moment, the text positioning you. Well, there are a number of ways. Can anyone suggest some of them? How does the text position you? Yep.
It plays with your emotions.
Yep, that's good. And you've already done some literary theory on that, haven't you? So reader response theory, you actually empathise or analogise with situations in the text. So, yep, plays with your emotions. Anything else? How about the use of literary devices that underpin that playing with your emotions? So different words, different combinations of words.
Semiotics.
Semiotics, yep. Okay, so it can be the visuals as well as the words, the combination. It can also be sounds with electronic text and so on. So it's all of these things, literary devices, linguistic devices, structural devices, are put together, intentionally or not, to position you as a reader to agree with the text. Okay, the next point is, how does a reader have any power to resist a text positioning? Well, this is where you get into the notion of you go from your agreeing with the text to the next two. So that's with the text, across a text or against a text. So let's go back to the idea of the text is positioning you in a certain way. A simple way of remembering what reading across a text is that you agree with most of what the text says, but you say, yes, but. Okay? So you might just pull out, a text doesn't just have one discursive position or one ideological track to it. It has a number of them. And there might be just, for example, if you look at the literary devices, one character with who personifies an ideology which you disagree with. So the yes, but. You agree with most of it, but you pull out one particular thing. And that's something that you can use practically when you're doing your assignment to pull out, say, a character or a group of characters in a particular situation and intervene at that level. So that's what I mean by reading across a text. You're partly agreeing and you're partly disagreeing. So it's a yes but. Yep.
I thought a cross was when you agree with the ideologies and the discourse has been discussed, but
Yep.
you didn't like the way that the author tried to put it across, like you believe that there could be a better way of describing those ideologies.
There could be an alternative way, yeah.
So you
Yep.
still agree with the whole concept being discussed, but you
Yep.
would structure it differently. Is that reading?
Yes, that's another nuance of it. Yep, that's fine. So you're basically still agreeing with most of it, but there's some aspect of it, and it might be that there's multiple. The way I was explaining it was there's multiple discourses and ideologies, and you're pulling out one of them. The way you're explaining it, which is equally valid, is that there's one, but there's an aspect of the one that you want to go across. So that's perfectly okay. Okay, so that is in some of the literature called an alternative reading. So across means partly disagreeing, and it's often referred to as an alternative reading. Okay, finally, this is a bit like the debaters who say, stand up for rebuttal and say, I have 3 problems with the opposition's case, which basically means they disagree. So it's disagreeing with the ideological positioning of the text. And this is probably the easiest and the hardest. It's easy to disagree, but there are some pitfalls which I notice you're going to be looking at later in the lecture, which is doing a subversion of the positioning rather than an inversion. I'll leave that for you to do later. But the easy way and the not satisfactory way of reading against a text is to just flip it over. So, for example, a lot of the so-called feminist picture books were seen to be feminist, and I say so-called because they basically replaced the male characters with female characters but left any of the more odious features of masculinity, just transposed them onto females. So they were still not very nice people in the end. And you've probably have you read picture books like that? So they became, Princess Smarty Pants and a few of those you'll see in the library. So that's that is a resistant reading, but it's not a very clever resistant reading because you really haven't thought through more satisfactory social alternatives to the reading. Okay, so why bother? It's my 4th point. Well, practically you have to do the assignment, don't you? But why bother in the long term? This is basically a life skill. Being able to do this sort of stuff in your head enhances the capabilities you have as a reader. So you don't need to be actually doing textual interventions all the time. You can do them in your head. So it's quite satisfying to be able to do that, and it deepens your understanding of text generally. The other thing is that while you're doing that, you really have to make claims on your knowledge of textual devices and literary devices. So you're actually expanding that out as well. So it's a way of enhancing your literacy. And that's why this is a course that's core, it's not core, it is actually part of, this way of thinking is part of English in schools, but it's also a special course in Year 12. Did you know that? Extension English. Okay. Did anyone do that course? Okay. All right. So basically, it's a course where you concentrate for the whole year on reading practices. and I was involved in writing that originally. Now, what I'd like to do is finish up with, I've written a paper a couple of years ago, and it's more to do with the way in which you can use these sorts of skills in research. So is anyone thinking of going on to do honours? You should actually think of it. It's okay, right. But you actually do it as part of the 4 years. So you know, I'm sure Ian will be able to discuss things like that. But I've used these ideas not only in teaching English and in writing as well, but also in research. And I've got a paper which looks at some narratives that I collected from older Italians in North Queensland. And what I did was a kind of a transformation or an intervention with some of the interviews with some historical data. So I'm going to give you that paper, so it might give you some ideas for doing your own assignment. And it plays with the notion of reader-text interaction and the idea of reader positioning. So it really pushes those boundaries on those concepts a bit. So as I promised, there's time for questions. So any questions? I'm dying to hear where you're up to and what you're doing and what you're thinking. So I don't get to do this very often, so you've got to hear me a bit. Any questions? What are you having most difficulty with at the moment?
Just like trying to understand how the discourses and ideologies come into play with the reading across against the reading.
Okay, so recognising the discourses.
Yeah.
Okay.
What they are and how they affect the text.
Okay, well there's a number of ways of doing that, and one of the really simple ways is to do a word list of what you think are the words, the categories of words that are present in a text. And then when you get them together in bunches, you can start to see a way in which a pattern starts to emerge about a positioning. So they might be all words that are, I don't know, derogatory about cats, you know, and so you can start to see, you know, an animal discourse emerging. So that's a very simple way of doing it. Another way, and that's any sort of word, but another slightly more refined way of doing it, and I think I've done this in that article called Multiple Readings of a Picture Book, a lexical analysis where you do nouns, verbs and adjectives. And that's probably a bit more sophisticated because by including the verbs, or the processes, as you'd call it in linguistics, you'd actually be able to see what the actions are. So how the ideology is functioning as a social practice. Okay. Anything else? Yep.
In relation to that, so what do you mean, like, do random list categories of words that we think might be present?
Yep.
So, say the book was about, I don't know, I'll use war, but we do it like categories of words for like pro-war and categories of words for anti-war and see which one's more.
Yeah, you could do that on a, so it's a bit of a, it's a kind of content analysis on a small section. So you'd have to have a gut reaction to start with, I guess, and then you basically play around because it's the words and the patterning of the words that actually construct the discourses and are used to position the reader. Yeah.
So are we looking for the jargon used by a particular group, and then that's the discourse?
You could, yeah.
And if you identify the jargon, is that like all the slang terms used in that group, or even the terms that they use? Is that how you establish the
Yeah,
discourse?
because it's a way of talking. Yep, that's
Within that
yep,
discourse.
yep, that's right. Yep.
That's incredibly time consuming.
Yeah, yeah.
Sounds like a lot of hard work.
It is a lot of hard work, and you've got to kind of be into detail. As you'll see, if you just flick through this article that you're going to get in PDF, you'll see how I do it. And I probably overdo it for your purposes, because I look at the way the words are, the intonations and so on as well. So it's in more, this is an interview text, yeah. But, you know, you have to be able to justify that this is a particular discursive position that is being offered by the text. So you've got to do it some way. You can't just say it's that, you know. So you've got to be able to back it up in terms of those, like the structure or the literary or textual devices in some way. So
Is that something you generally, you've read the text, and like this matching gut feeling, so you feel that there might be something.
That's right.
This is a way to confirm that it is.
that's right, yep, yep. You also would do it through a bit of knowledge of other texts. So you'd read another text, something like that, another newspaper article or so on, and that would give you a lead, if you like. So you're following a lead to try to confirm that lead. Anything else? I know you've got lots of questions. You'd like to. Okay,
Thank you very much indeed.
pleasure.
Big thank you. Yeah, I'll put that on. I'll put the paper Greer's talking about. I'll put on the website tonight, so you'll have it there. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Well, that's marvellous. That's given us a lot more to think about. It's brilliant that Greer got to come along. We also have another guest today, which is Ben. And Ben, you'll get to know Ben very well. Be very nice to him. He's your pathway to success.
Yeah.
So chocolates, flowers, all sorts of gifts, and
Yeah.
he'll accept anything.
Yeah.
Ben's just here today to sort of see how many of you there are and get to know what we're doing a little bit and how it sounds. So, okay, so lots to pick up on. Just to Julian, just to go back over your point, what Greer just talked about was content analysis, which is just one way of doing it, okay? So if it's the way you want to do it, that's absolutely fine. But content analysis is just one way. So if you're sat there thinking, I'm not the sort of person who wants to count verbs, then don't worry, there are other ways of doing it. And next week, Ben's going to be doing a lecture on hypertext. The week after, the lecture and the tute is all based around methodology. And you know it already, because all the reader response theory we did just before the break, turns into methods that you can use for your assignment. That's the kind of clever reveal, if you like. So suddenly, da-da, you have what would be known in managerialism as a toolbox from which you can draw, and you have plenty of tools available. So don't start to panic too soon, but great questions. You are a very good group in terms of questions, so well done. Good questions. I was proud. Right, so we're looking at assignment 3, and I promise you that we'll be doing nothing in lectures and tutes that won't address this assignment. So I wanted to just point out that the Will Context-Centred Reading, no way of making that better.
Actually, on your machine at home, you've got to switch the lights off. Oh, the lights.
By
You should have lights off.
hitting lights. Oh, it's better. Okay, you can see that now. Right, so yeah, the two things: Will context-centred. All right, now don't get stuck around that terminology. Just look at page 15 of your reader, and that's the QSA, Queensland Studies Authority, and they define what I need you to know as world context-centred readings. All right. So it's actually two sides of A4. So read and inwardly digest. That's what I absolutely need you to know about it. All right. There are other things you can read and go outside the readings, outside the sources. But that's basically what I need you to know. And also the idea of a resistant reading, and what we're trying to do in this particular assignment, you need to have your head round page 11 of your handbook, which is where assignment 3 is detailed. So assignment 3 is completely detailed there. I need you to read that by next week. All right, because when Ben starts to talk about stuff around hypertext, I don't want anyone sat here going, I don't really know what it is. What's he talking about? I don't know, that's just not going to be good enough to use Ben, and he's expensive, okay, so we need to use him very well. Yes, I want everyone to really, really have their head behind and around what this assignment is, if you haven't already. Okay, so assignment 3. So we're going to cover a few things that Greer already did, but hopefully in a bit more detail. So this idea of a textual intervention. Last week we talked about the political nature of teaching literature, and the basis, Greer touched on it as well, the idea of developing textual interventions as a life skill. It really is a skill that we're developing for students for life. And so let's not lose sight of the fact we're trying to make our students less passive, obedient readers. That's the whole point. We want, believe it or not, we want kids to go, well, that's not true, I don't believe in that, I don't agree, etc. So, firstly, as Greer was talking about, texts have the power to position us. So as we're reading a text, the text is positioning us. Now we can talk about whether that was an intention of the writer or not, or intention of the marketing of the text or not. Also bear in mind that when we talk about texts, we are talking about cultural texts as well, not just literary texts. So all texts, I talked about MasterChef last week. Well, I've really gone off now, it's just too long and it goes on and on, doesn't it? I stopped caring, was the point. I stopped caring about MasterChef. I don't care who wins. But so I was positioned and I gave up, really. So try to position me as someone who really cares. That's the kind of position I was asked to take. Someone who really cares who wins, who cares about people's grandmother's apple pie recipe and blah-de-blah-de-blah. And I actually don't care at all. That was my position. So I'm working very much against MasterChef at the moment. But we then... So if texts have the power to position us, we then have to find the power to be able to resist that positioning. And that's the point of this final assignment. So reading against the text can be demonstrated by textual interventions in the form of a rewritten text, so rewriting the text in some way. Comedies are really good. As Greer was talking, I'm going to try and find does anyone know Little Britain as a... Yes. Little Britain as a comedy show. There's a couple of things on Little Britain which I find hysterical, but there's also there's a level of discomfort around it, And we talked about this when I was teaching last year in London. We talked about this then, that students were loving Little Britain, and we were talking about irony and satire and pastiche and things like that. And if you read, you can read Little Britain with Little Britain, in which case you'd read it as an entirely racist, rather sexist, very homophobic. Well, you could go on, really. It's a horrendous show, really. And you could decide to read with it. Yeah? Or you could read across it. Now, across is the usual way we read Little Britain. And that's what makes it funny. Because we can go, oh my God, that's so racist. Oh. When the woman at Fact Fighters says to the Asian lady, I don't understand what you're saying. Can you speak slower, love, and all that kind of, and I'm a lady, and all that kind of thing. That is all terribly, terribly dodgy stuff. But we're reading across it. So we're agreeing with most of it. We think it's funny, but there's a bit we don't agree with. And we're deciding reading against that, across that, yeah? And because we're reading across it, it forms a kind of a point of an energy, yeah? That allows us to find it funny. That's not the right word, it will come to me in a second. It produces an energy, yeah? Because that's what the humour's about. It's slightly uncomfortable. So there is a sense of cringing slightly with Little Britain. Some of it's too gross, when that woman just throws up everywhere, and some of their stuff around mental health and disability is very dodgy, but we're finding it funny because it's those two people. We know that they're politically kind of alright, so it must be okay. But, and that's a very dodgy text to put out there. It's a very dodgy text to put out in the world, because people can read that as, I worked in a few senior schools a few years ago, and I'm the only gay in the village came along. At such a bad time for any gay teenager trying to come out. Came along at a very bad time. I'm a lady. All that stuff came along at a very bad time in schools for when, because those kids were reading with it. Yeah, not reading across it. Can you see how that? So Little Britain tries to position us as a cross, but we can also take a with, and then we can also. So we, as a teaching team, we were talking about Little Britain, and we were saying, are we agreeing? Are we against this actually? Are we against that in schools? Is it okay to have is it okay to support a program and to laugh with a program? To teach you're very influential. If you start saying, I'm the only gay in the village, that gives the class permission to think that's okay, and you're reading with it. Is it okay to read it simply as the text it is? Or should we be actively reading against it? Yeah? Trying to subvert what they're trying to do. It is potentially harmful. So you need a level of irony in order to understand Little Britain the way it's intended.
That was read against.
To just talk about its homophobia and its racism, and that's not how it's intended. No, you'd look at it as a piece of racism and a piece, and it's not actually that hard to do. It's very easy to suddenly start losing, for it to stop being funny.
Skip recently on Hanging Saturday, the uproar in America.
Yeah, the blackface. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a whole note. We need a cup of coffee to talk about that. I hate the way Americans come in and just go, "That's racist," but they have no idea. It's like the Kentucky. Do you hear about the Kentucky Fried Chicken?
Yeah.
They don't even know what cricket is. So how do they know about West Indian?
Because that all black guys are really good.
Yeah, but it's about cricket. Okay, you could read, but that's a different way of reading it. But you're beginning to get it now. Good. Okay, so recognition of binary opposites assist in this process. How did I know it for you? Okay, let's bring down the hysteria a little bit. Recognition of binary oppositions. So within any text, there's a binary opposition, and its simplest form is how does this text produce evil, and how does it produce good? So what is its ideas around good and evil within the text? And the simplest form of a binary opposition within a text. We're going to talk about that a bit later. Okay, so complex transformations. I can't stop thinking about Transformers when I think it's not a bad move. So it requires an awareness of the invited reading. That's what Greer is saying. So before you can do anything, you have to do yourself an analysis of what you're reading. So you'll be given a chapter, and Ben, when are we allowed to? Ben's wonderfully done this course before. When are we allowed to give the chapter out?
Oh, as soon as you like.
Oh, really? Okay, I'll do it soon then. So you'll have a chapter very soon of Tomorrow When the War Began, and
The chapter will be open on, I think, next Wednesday.
next one. Oh, 'cause
No, actually, I'm not going to allow anything to happen until week 10, because I don't want people to make a mistake with what they're trying to do.
Right,
so
so
I want the first thing they do is in the tutorial.
So you'll be introduced to this text from Ben in the tutorial on week 10, okay?
But they've got their book, and they know that
They've read it. They're very good. They're very good. So you have your book, but there'll be a chapter in the book which we'll introduce you to in week 10, and that's what we're wanting you to do a texture analysis of, not the whole book, okay? Wanting close reading and close texture analysis. So, and we want something that's beyond a simple intervention. So a simple intervention would be simply with. Okay, now you can do partly a with reading, but we're wanting a bit more than that as well. We're wanting to use understanding gained from the reading and of the text, and how you're being asked as a reader to fill in the gaps and silences. And I'm going to talk about gaps and silences a bit more in a minute. And this involves making a discursive shift. And this is a word that's come up a few times in this course, specifically after the break. And I'm just wanting to talk to you about discursivity, which is a very important term in the area of cultural studies and literary studies. And it's not simply about discussing, that's what it means, but it refers back to discourse, the idea of discourse. And who developed the idea of discourse as a cultural? Foucault. Yes, thank you. Who said that? Thank you, well done, Bruce. Yes, Foucault. So Foucault talked about discourse, which is a process of developing a cultural meaning. So Greer just talked about, you could look at the discourse of, what was it she said? Cats or animals. Yeah, the discourse of owning animals. That's a discourse. Yeah. I would like us to think about the discourse around work. Yeah. So what is work? When do we start work? What do we do work for? How much of our wages do we give away? That's a discourse. The idea that we are taxed on our work. How work is valued. And I'm also aware that during this course there are things that come up like discourse and discursivity and Foucault and Marxism and all sorts of things. And just be very aware that you're learning about political philosophy through literary studies. Okay, so if you don't know about this, yet, if you hadn't come across the idea of hegemony or neo-Marxism, or that's fine, you're not meant to, that's kind of why you're here. But you are learning about political philosophy and sociology through literature, okay, because they melded at the point of a contemporary reading, at the point where we looked at postmodernism, literary studies and political philosophy and sociology all kind of came together. So we're going to look at, so discursivity is how cultural meanings come to be. Yeah, which is the same as discourse and the same as discursive shift. So if you're making a shift which is discursive, you're trying to change the way things are viewed within that text. So making Ellie, for instance, in Tomorrow When the War Began, a man, would be a good way of doing that. Yeah? Or seeing it from the soldier's point of view would be a good way of doing it. It's a discursive shift. Right, so we talk about binary oppositions, and this was a very important moment. So we talked about Saussure, yeah, and structuralism, and the idea of structural linguistics, the idea of the sign and the signifier. The other very key idea that came up in postmodern literary studies is the idea of binary oppositions, which is very, very straightforward. It sounds kind of freaky and a bit weird, but it's very, very easy to understand. So it's the idea of opposing concepts that are encoded within the text. We don't often know they're happening, and we activate them through how we read the text. So we're reading the text and we're activating, it's almost like we're unlocking the binary oppositions throughout the text. So the binary opposition can be about city, country, I think I've put, sort of male, female, home and away, war, peace, good, evil, hot, cold, male, female. So it's all about oppositions, opposites, polar opposites. And within the text, there'll be a multiple of these. There'll be a multiple set of values attached to each of these binary opposites. And one binary opposite will be higher than the other, will be valued beyond the other. So one way of reading, a good way of reading a chapter and doing an analysis of a chapter would be to look through binary oppositions. And that will be known as a deconstruction of the text. And this is a form of literary criticism, deconstruction. If you're at all interested in deconstruction, which you don't have to be, but if you want to take it a step further, Jacques Derrida and Guattari Spivak are the two people who are very famous when it comes to the idea of deconstruction. And that idea is that if an identity is constructed, if society is constructed, if we're all constructed, yeah, and nothing's essential, nothing's real, nothing's natural, then we can deconstruct it all, can't we? We can unravel it. We spend most of our lives stitching it together, and knitting it together, and agreeing, and complying, and being obedient, and making sure that we nod in the right times and do the right thing, yeah? To comply and stitch the constructions of our society together. Be the good man, be the good woman, be the good sister, be the good student, yeah? Be seen as the successful whatever. So if we do that, we can also deconstruct. So that's on a kind of larger, scarier way, deconstructing the world. But we have got to, so we can't do that. That's just far too big. You might do, I'm sure some of you will end up doing that in your research life. But just for now, we're looking at a chapter of When the War Began. And you can deconstruct that. So what you can do is look within this particular chapter, or the book as a whole, that's what you have right now, and think about what binary opposition. There are some very clear binary oppositions in that book. You know, can anyone think of one binary oppositions in that book?
Female leader.
So female, male. Yeah. So there's kind of a hierarchy of this female woman who can think, keep going. Yeah. What else is there?
Freedom and captivity.
Freedom and captivity, absolutely. It's a philosophical, and Ali comes to that at the end, doesn't she? And talks about, yeah. Good, yes, us and man, the other. Very good. We could carry on. There's city, the bush, there's, or hell and heaven, I mean, you know, hell, over-symbolised thing in the book, you know. So there's lots of stuff going on in terms of binary oppositions. So what you have to do is expose the binaries, and by exposing the binaries, that's another form of analysis. The same way Greer was talking about looking at verbs, exposing a binary set is another, and looking at the middle, because between the binaries there exists a space. That's what Derrida talked about, the space between. Also a guy called Homi Bhabha, which is a strange name, I know, B-A-B-B-A-B-A, Bhabha, talked about the middle ground, what's actually in the middle. Yeah? Because there is something in the middle. There isn't just, is there really just freedom and captivity? Isn't there something kind of rather messier? I mean, they're breeding chickens, for God's sake. You know, there's something messier in the middle. Yeah? They're not free. So what is that? Yeah? So that's the gap, the contradiction and the slippages. So the slippages is when an ideology sets itself up within the text but can't maintain itself. It's nonsensical. So you'll keep hearing it slide all the time. And the narrator, I think, I haven't done an analysis of this, so I can't say for certain, but I think the narrator is a key point. So I think the narrative voice within Tomorrow When the War Began keeps losing Ellie. I think Ellie and the narrative voice keep separating. And that's why sometimes I think, where is she? Who is she talking about? There's a point when I'm not, I can be very stupid, but I'm not that stupid. I can read a novel, but every now and then, the narrative voice, I get lost. You know, so I don't feel held. So Ellie sets herself up as a very clear, reliable narrator, and she's not. So what's going on? So there's a slippage there. So that's the kind of analysis you can do. So gaps and silences are the places or incompleteness within a text. And there are incomplete moments, and there's huge areas. And we can only assume that later, and there's somebody here, I can't see her right now, who's gone on and read the rest of the... Who's gone on and read any more books?
I read them.
Yeah? Who's that? You did. Yes, right, Anne, yourself. So I don't want to know, by the way, but I can only assume that the other books kind of explain things a bit more. But there are huge gaps, actual physical gaps, between we don't know the faces or we don't know who the invader is or what they're doing. We only have reports back from what's happening really around it. So there's huge spaces and gaps. There's also ideological gaps. And there's silences. I mean, we talked about this last week, I think, in some of the tutorials. There are whole groups of people, whole characters within the text that don't actually live within the text. They live within Ellie's imagination or Ellie's memory. They're not within the text, so they are silenced. Yeah, the text silences them and their ability to live and develop within the text. So there's lots of things going on in terms of gaps and silences. That would also be an element of deconstruction. Okay, now, this is something that Greer alluded to, and it's this idea of inversion, so inverting something, turning it over, making it upside down, is not subversion. So inverting something, you could get away with it's an across reading. You know, so in the Piggy book we read last week, rather clumsily, the mother left and the boys started ironing and she did the calm. She ended up maintaining a calm. A fascinating book, Ben. I must let you have a read of it. You've seen it, but you've had the joy of it. That is an inversion. And that's what Greer was talking about in terms of feminist picture books. That's just an inversion of the roles in the text. And there's this idea of dualism. So when we're talking about binary opposition, we're talking about two. Yeah? So a dualistic world. It's the idea of men and women is a dualistic concept. So what you do is you just create another dualism, don't you, if you invert it. So instead of women and men, there's men and women. But you haven't really done anything different. You know, it might be a point of comedy to see women doing something that men should be doing. And this whole idea, in order for women to have any rights as women, they have to become men. And Maggie Thatcher is a perfect example of that. Yeah? There's lots of women who've had to become men in order to be the best woman they can, or to get the power they need. And that will be an inverted society, not a subverted. So what's subversion? Why is that different? You could invert something, you can subvert it.
Substitute. So it's like you read against it. The subversion when you read against the text is the same.
Well, both you could say are readings against the text. One is simply that you've inverted it. Then there's the idea of subversion.
Take it from somewhere else.
Doing something very different with it. Yeah. So it could be substituting bits of it for something else. Yeah. So completely changing it. So not just creating another dualism, which you could argue is simply reading across any text anyway. The ideology stays the same as the characters have changed. And so just be careful when you're thinking about reading against the text. Greer was saying it's the kind of easiest, but the hardest at the same time. You haven't simply inverted something. So really, to read the text from the point of view of one of the soldiers, is that an inversion or a subversion? Yeah. Depends what you did with it, I suppose. But you could see that as just an inversion. All you've done is change the position. And it can be quite fruitful and funny and or useful, but it's not a subverted text. It's not the subversion we're looking for. Okay, so I've got one example and then we're done, so we've just got 5 minutes to go. I looked at Dracula, so as you know by now, it's one of my favourite. I taught a class on Gothic literature, so all that stuff is kind of in my area. And Dracula, there's been a couple of versions where what I looked at how Dracula was turned into a film. And we have to remember that Dracula in the first place is a writing up of a myth, a set of myths, a myth scheme, yeah? About Vlad Dracul and all that stuff. So Vlad the Impaler, etc. So we have to remember that what I'm talking about is Stoker's novel, right? So I'm not necessarily talking about the vampire myth necessarily. It starts to become difficult when I start thinking about reading against stuff here, but we'll come to that in a second. So reading with the text, and that's Bram Stoker's Dracula, book Dracula. There are versions that have been overtly with the text. So Nosferatu is very much with the text. It's an alternate. Do you know Nosferatu? Well, Nosferatu is an absolutely terrifying 1930s German film based on Dracula, and that's the okay, absolutely terrifying. There's something about that black and white creepiness that makes the whole thing just far more frightening. So try and find Nosferatu. Nosferatu was very dedicated to the text, wanted to make a film version of the text. And also, Francis Ford Coppola, I think it was. Has anyone seen this version with Gary Oldman? Yeah. Again, terrifying, but brilliant version. And this was actually marketed as Bram Stoker's Dracula. So you get a pretty good idea that they're trying their best anyway to work with the text. Okay, there's no jiggery-pokery going on here. Right, nothing's changed. They're doing their best. And I don't know if you remember, but around that time, it was in the early 90s, I think, 93. Around that time, there were a number of other films. There was Kenneth Branagh directed Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. You know, and it all came from a legacy of the Merchant Ivory films. So Merchant Ivory were replicating books like Howard's End and turning them into films, but in a very dedicated way in terms of the link to the novel itself. So that came at the end of that really, as a trend. So that's with. Okay, we're not finished yet, so can we continue to focus? That's with. Across, I was looking at Frank. Oh, who's this? Langella? No.
I know who it is. He's also in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the 1930s version.
Yeah, Bela Lugosi.
That's it.
Bela Lugosi, kind of very early film about Dracula, but nothing to do with the story of Dracula, just the character of Dracula. And also the Hammer horror films. So Dracula, Prince of Darkness, that's it. This will terrify you, that's what it says there. Which it did, I remember as a kid, saying, this whole blood and stuff. Now these things here have absolutely nothing to do with Dracula, apart from some of the myths there. They do contain the character Dracula. The myths hold it together in terms of, because Dracula does have an ideology. Does anyone know what the ideology of Dracula is? Don't look in a mirror. It's quite interesting when you look at mythology and ideology. I mean, there are serious political ideologies in mythology, but there are also, nighttime is when, there's discourse around things living at night. That's the Gothic discourse around what we can't see, which we're afraid of, etc. So, this is very much reading across the text, and reading against the text was a film that I loved as a kid called Love at First Bite. Anyone seen that, Gem? No, it's very, very good. There's also Buffy, as you know, picking up, and what Buffy's doing is picking up the vampire legend. The reason it has got, does anyone know? Can anyone figure out why am I saying that Buffy is against the text in terms of Stoker? You could just say Buffy's a version of the vampire legend.
That's slaying dragons, or slaying vampires.
Yeah, there's all, the whole idea, exactly, so they're picking up the Van Helsing, the idea of slaying, the good against the evil ideology, absolutely. Plus also it's full of all the stuff that Stoker invented. Stoker invented all this stuff around, how do you kill a vampire? We all know. What food stuff does vampires hate? There we go. we know this because it's been carefully woven into all of these, as a discourse. You know, you could say, you could argue that the idea of vampiric protection is discourse. The cross, yes.
Whereas in a lot of the Twilight things, they explain their way out of it.
Right, well I put Twilight there in slight trepidation because I've seen one film, but that's all I know about Twilight. But I do think the kind of the base ideas are there. So they might want to talk their way out of it, but they're still there. They're having to explain that away, aren't they? So they are really using Stoker's text because it was Stoker that invented. That's not true. I mean, first of all, there's no such thing as vampires. Sorry, I know. And secondly, they don't hate garlic because they don't exist. So, yeah. So that entire myth set, comes from one novel, Stoker's novel. So we have to refer Twilight and Buffy back to the original Stoker novel because he's the guy who invented the steak, the garlic, the cross, the mirror, the light, all that stuff. Coffin. Would what? Sorry, I forgot that. Either a cross or a cross, probably. Yeah. Yes, within previously a bit more. You're not quite as Twilight as the other. No. Yeah. And there's always sorry. Yeah, again, I start to say yes to that. But yes, okay, so yes. But also, I mean, Twilight, guys, we'll finish on time. Twilight does pick up on other themes that are in Stoker beyond the vampire, and that's the theme of romance. Because Dracula, essentially, is a romantic Gothic novel. It's very romantic, incredibly sensual, and so all of these pick up on that. I mean, Christopher Lee, handsome man. Handsome man. Dapper man. You know. I can't say the same for Nosferatu, but certainly Gary Oldman has moments in his Dracula where, it's like, suave. You know, so, and obviously we've got this, I should know this man's name, but I don't. What's his name?
Robert Pattinson.
Yes, obviously he's quite good looking as well, do you think? And then we have the whole angel thing going on. Yeah. So there are other themes that this text is picking up on. We're going to look at these key questions. We're going to look at these key questions in the tutorials. Okay, so hopefully you've prepared something for that. If you haven't, and you haven't got a tutorial in 2 hours, you've got a tutorial tomorrow, can you please make sure you have prepared something? We're looking at a text and those 4 questions. And the basic question from last week, whose interests are served by these representations of the world in a text? And we go back for Joel. Joel? Yeah, so who's served? Who gets served by this text? Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention. We'll see you in the tutorial.
Is that for our meeting?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, not until tomorrow afternoon. Also, you get the big recording as you said. So I'll put that as well. So you can spam it. Yeah. I didn't realise. time to fill one job. And within 20 minutes, I have it. Alright. It's over there.
So probably people didn't actually get this on. So what are we actually doing with this assignment? Like, I know we're constructing a website. What's the other part of it? Is it actually like rewriting a chapter?
No, it's a defence. So you know, like Bob. You read Bob's Defence.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's like writing one of those, but you're defending your version of. You're defending your website.
Okay.
Yeah, don't worry. You meant to be a little bit in there. Sorry.
I'm so lost.
Don't feel lost. I mean, we'll bring that to the tutorial. Make sure you feel a little more centred.
I think about it a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it does sound. No, seriously, I mean, it kind of is. I know it sounds a bit trite, but it's sort of getting used to that feeling of never quite being sure.
Oh, I've
There's
always
some-
been.
But don't worry, that's not you. That's just how it is.
So discourse is like the way people speak and like use text to talk and.
Well, the power of language to produce specific ideas,
So-
cultural ideas.
Yeah. And ideology is slightly different.
Ah, yeah, good question. Usually, hold on, let me just do this and I can.